Welcome back, and let's talk once again about what the what the newspaper situation, what the mass media situation in the U.S. looks like in relation to the political structure. So, Chapter 3 covers a lot of this, and what I want to just briefly touch upon once again is your essay question and whether this will aid you at all in covering any of that and giving an analysis. So the first thing is want to talk about the history of these phenomena in relation to kind of how the civic picture is emerging in the U.S. So one of the questions you're being asked to evaluate is the U.S. mass media fulfilling, and news media particularly fulfilling, its civic obligation, its civic responsibility in providing a civic space. And in turn, are people becoming dependent on that structure, whatever it is? So, to answer that question, I think this chapter will be pretty helpful to you in terms of the information that's provided. One of them is just to draw a picture of a fairly, I would have to say, it paints a picture of a media that's sort of an oligopoly. It even uses that word. So let's start with that one. So an oligopoly is just think of a monopoly, which is when any one provider dominates any one particular market, or any one firm dominates a market. In this case, it's a few firms dominate every market, and that is referring to both the mass media market in the United States, but also the individual kind of metro markets that operate throughout the United States. So, the six largest newspaper chains in the United States, they provide 38% of the total paper circulation of 40 million. So that's not quite an oligopoly, but it is sort of almost a pluralistic oligopoly. There's 38% or almost 40% of newspapers, about 18 or 19 million out of the total 40 million are provided by just six newspaper chains. Gannett, the Associated Press, and a few more. So that's some competition, but it's not a lot of competition as we tend to think of the kind of mass media as free and open. And most of these small markets that we've seen are actually very controlled by just a few major conglomerates, one of which is Sinclair Broadcasting is a pretty good example. They've been the beneficiaries of pretty loose ownership structure regulations the FCC has allowed over the decades, from a very tight fisted kind of policy where they only granted licenses to people who could prove they had ties to the community and had ties to some ethic of journalistic responsibility. Today, Sinclair has really gobbled up a lot of local news stations. And the reason they have done this is simply because it's profitable. So the author, Shantu Iyengar, is a professor at Stanford University. And so he thought, I live closest to the San Francisco media market. And, while it may be outliers in a lot of things, it's not an outlier in terms of how its TV stations perform. So he took San Francisco as an example of, there are 5 local news stations. Okay, 5 local TV stations that have news coverage. And he calculated that on a typical night, out of 15 hours of primetime hours on commercial stations on a typical weeknight, 10.5 of those hours are actually dominated by local news coverage. And, why is that significant necessarily? So from 4 o'clock to 7 o'clock, so what? That 2/3 of that time is taken up by local news. Haven't we all grown to maybe accept that? Well, the thing is, local news isn't always what we think it is. Local news coverage, for example, is dominated by advertising and commercials. And advertising and commercials, just to give you an example from the textbook, you may have read that the coverage of local politicians during an election is outnumbered in terms of time by advertising to reporting by a factor of 10 to 1. So you will see 10 times more advertisements about politicians than you will see reporting on politicians, even during the local news. And so that's a pretty stark kind of wake-up call to what exactly is going on here with local news. Why are people watching it? I mean, people watch it because of weather. People watch it because it's a lead-in to their favorite show that comes on afterwards, Jeopardy or Wheel of Fortune. I think are still pretty popular ones. And sometimes people's favorite sitcom. But also because so that's why people watch it. But the reason they put it on the air is because it's profitable. Because no matter what your tastes in other walks of life, there's still a segment of society that will watch the local news because they feel like it's important. But they're drawn to a particular station because they have better weather coverage, or they have more entertaining news stories in some way, or it's on their favorite station. So this becomes even more important when you realize that nationally people are really paying attention to whichever news outlet they believe is more profitable to their historical worldview and their political worldview. But at the local level, you don't get that many choices, and so you just tend to watch whatever's on, or whatever is already playing on your television, or that you have a historical tie to in some way. So for whatever the reason, there's simply not this ideological divide at the local level. That may change soon. Sinclair, for example, does have, they are this kind of dominant player at the local station level, but they also have a decidedly conservative political view that they don't shy away from forcing their I say forcing, I mean compelling. Like they issue directives at the company level to read statements and to play videos of commentators that they have paid. They even at one point tried to make, I'm not sure if this is in your book, but they attempted to centralize weather from just their Baltimore station and just fire all their weather people and just send out a centralized tape of people reading the weather. That didn't work. But that's an example of the kind of cost cutting they've been trying to do. But they also have tried to impose a lot of control on their local stations. There is a video that I think I'll link to, so watch for that in your Canvas course. Because there is this hostile media phenomenon that at the local level doesn't really exist yet. The hostile media phenomenon that I'm sure we've all seen play out at the White House actually the last several years, is that President Trump has taken this tack that not only is Fox News, for example, a very favorable media outlet towards him, but other media outlets are inherently hostile. And he has really engendered this viewpoint and encouraged it to the extent it already existed. It was there, but it's gone up markedly from something like a distrust of the media was by, I think, Republicans, if I'm remembering that statistic right from the textbook, it was 40%, and now it's up to 70%. So he really has had an impact in that regard in fomenting this distrust of the media. And the author posits that it's and not just out of his own opinion, but out of his own kind of research and the accepted research in the field of political communication. There is something called the hostile media phenomenon, as I mentioned, and that is simply that, and let me get this right exactly from reading it. Strong Democrats and strong Republicans, as well as in the survey they've used, they put together pro-Israel or pro-Palestinian kind of people that have that political priority, believe that nonpartisan news reports tend to be biased actually in favor of their opponents. And so this is a growing phenomenon that people feel that there's a hostile media out there, but people have different definitions of what the mainstream media is. And so this hostile media phenomenon is one that more and more people are kind of inherently adopting as part of their worldview. It is, it has varying degrees of truth to it, but there are kind of three things that have influence on what's reported, and Iyengar gives a lot of credit to the market forces in terms of its explanatory power in the media. But he doesn't say that it actually has a total determinative power on what you see in the news. He does say that there are oligopolies. Okay. He does say that there are oligopolies, and he does say that there are market forces that impact what you see on the local news and what you see in the national news. As I talked about in the last video, you tend to see more coverage of people that is designed to get ratings as opposed to what is meant to be helpful in terms of the public service and civic responsibility notion that news is supposed to provide. There's a quote from there used to be an ethic in the U.S., and there's a quote from it in the textbook that an owner of, I believe, CBS has said that his directive to the news organization that was CBS News was, you guys do the news. I've got Jack Benny to make money for me. Jack Benny, today's, Jimmy Fallon or Stephen Colbert or James Corden or anybody else. So that's less true today. The news has this pressure to make a profit, to get viewers, to get ratings, and that's become the priority over necessarily telling what may be boring news stories that may be actually impactful to a majority of people. And so they are vulnerable to this idea that people want to know immediately if they know what's going on in politics, if they know who's popular, and they know who's going to win the next electoral race. And that's called horse race coverage. And as I mentioned last time, horse race coverage tends to dominate the news in this kind of profit-driven environment in a way that it really doesn't in other OECD countries, in a way that in European countries. But it makes the media vulnerable to manipulation by political campaigns that are trying to win. And so instead of covering one candidate or another's favorable or unfavorable political platform that may be popular or unpopular to people, they tend to just report on the campaigning of the campaigns. So, for example, there are the two kind of top historical, and I would say because of that, most well-researched campaign ads of all time in U.S. politics are what's called the Daisy ad and the Willie Horton ad. And both were put out, incidentally, by presidential candidates based out of Texas. And I don't know, you can take that for whatever it's worth. But the Daisy ad was one that I'll also link to, and make sure I remember to do that. So the Daisy ad was one that Lyndon Johnson put out in 1964 during a campaign that he was clearly winning anyway. And this ad was a little girl picking flower petals that she was counting up from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and then it kind of zoomed into her eye, and it started a nuclear countdown to a nuclear explosion. And you saw this nuclear explosion narrated by Lyndon B. Johnson saying that these are the stakes. We either must love one another or we must die, something to that effect. And it was run once in prime time, and the next night it was run on all three major news networks. So tens of millions of people saw that ad in real time, and millions more have studied it after that for its impact. But those news organizations covered it because it was news, because many people saw it, because a major political campaign did it, not because it had any particular actual impact. It was art. It was campaign art that may or may not be provocative. Another one was what's called the Willie Horton ad, and the Willie Horton ad was about a person in Massachusetts who was paroled and given a furlough, actually, by then Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis, who was the Democratic nominee. And in this ad, it detailed in graphic detail the assault on a couple in Maryland that were then paraded by the Bush campaign around the country. And at first, the Bush campaign disavowed its responsibility for it, saying it was an independent ad. But actually, later on, the consultant on his deathbed essentially had admitted that the Bush campaign was behind the Willie Horton ad. And it was an ad about this person who had been furloughed, and the story of what happened when he was temporarily let out on sort of a pass from prison. That's much less common today, probably because of this ad and because of this crime. And it kind of laid responsibility for that criminal behavior at the feet of Michael Dukakis himself, the Democratic nominee. So, and Willie Horton was African American, and the couple was white. And there was a couple of ads surrounding the Willie Horton ad that were very, very incendiary and are considered literally textbook cases now for people when they talk about racism and evoking racism in political campaigns. So those are really the top two ads that were so controversial that many of the major news networks reported on them immediately and reran the ads while they're doing it, and so really doing the campaign's work for them. So in order to kind of counter this ability of campaigns to be manipulated, and to manipulate them, the field of journalism has taken to what's being called interpretive coverage. And then interpretive coverage is something that we might call punditry, where you see a bunch of journalists either sit around remotely or at a table, and they all sort of debate that week's news or that day's news. And a lot of this is defended by journalists. A lot of it we talk about as talking heads. Jon Stewart at one point said that CNN's version of this was they were ruining America. And that show, Crossfire, eventually was canceled directly. It's attributed almost to his appearance on it. But really, it's a way for journalists to maintain their independence so that they're not seen, at least, to be manipulated so directly by market forces and ownership and ratings, so that they have credibility, so that people will pay attention to them, but also so that they individually can have careers and they're not just interchangeable, to borrow the same phrase, talking heads, so that you can see that they're really good at their jobs and they can advance in their journalistic careers, not by reporting and getting the story first, which is really something that's very difficult to do as you get older and older, I guess, as a journalist, but so that you can show some measure of expertise about what happens in the news media and what happens in maybe the political world. So journalistic norms and interpretive coverage are one of the things that impact what you see in the news. So let's see, market forces, oligopolies, and journalists themselves. But finally, the organizational processes, the kind of editors, really the bosses of reporters, and they're more of an intermediary force. So economic forces in terms of how much money a news outlet is bringing in, but then editors kind of have to filter and weigh, what is it that's newsworthy in terms of traditional journalistic norms, and then what's newsworthy in terms of what are people going to click on, what are people going to read, what are people going to watch. And so those are all three factors. And so we'll say editors, they all sort of so really the three things that influence these kind of just I want to conclude by saying that what Iyengar asserts are the three forces that impact what you see in the news are not just invisible forces that are tendencies. They are, but also they're really personally represented in terms of the roles that are played. So fundamentally, it's not just journalists that decide, even though they're the face. They're not what you see in the news. They're not directly responsible for what you see in the news. So even though, for example, they're heavily Democratic, owners are heavily Republican, and editors are really a little bit more blended than that. But these three kind of professions and these three kind of professional roles in virtually every organization are mediating factors in terms of what is going to be covered and shown and read and listened to in the news media. So that remains true no matter what news media outlet you're talking about. And if you have questions about any of this, I would encourage you to contact me or ask a question during the question and answer period that we have on Wednesday. So still one more to come in this module, Chapter 4. So I'll look forward to talking with you again soon about that. Okay.